Hi there, my name is Julian, and I was born into a household with two sisters. I always knew as a child that my sister Rachel was the focal point of our household. She was a miraculous baby born when I was 5 years old after my mother's tragic miscarriage. When she arrived, it was as if a vacuum had been filled, and Rachel was immediately lavished with love, care, and luxury beyond my wildest expectations. I didn't mind at first. I was old enough to comprehend why my parents wanted to give her all they had and why they were so protective of her. However, their partiality became more difficult to overlook as we got older. Rachel's lovely smile and large blue eyes made it impossible for her to do anything wrong. However, I was often ignored or chastised for even the simplest mistakes. It was just an accident when Rachel spilled juice on the carpet, but I was being irresponsible when I left my toys out by mistake. It was a trend that persisted throughout our early years. Rachel's actions were more deceptive as we grew older. Every time she got into trouble, she pretended to be innocent and cried when the time was right, playing our parents perfectly. I was accused of being cruel or envious if I attempted to defend myself or bring attention to what she had done. Mom would tell me, "You're the big sister. You should be a better role model." I can still clearly recall one occasion. Rachel was 7 and I was 12. When I challenged her, she destroyed my beloved snow globe, which was a gift from my grandmother, and started crying. Rachel had fabricated a scenario to make it look as if I had been ranting at her pointlessly by the time my mother showed there. While Rachel received ice cream to lift her spirits, I was grounded for a week. These kinds of incidents accumulated over time, causing a rift between us to only deepen. By my adolescence, Rachel's deceit had spread beyond our family. She was skilled at inciting drama, spreading falsehoods, and turning my friends against me. She would unintentionally destroy my schoolwork or take my clothing without asking, just to return them ripped or discolored. Every time, she had a quick justification or a heartfelt apologies that caused my parents to ignore it. They would remark, "She's just a kid. Stop being so harsh with her." I attempted to discuss Rachel's actions with my parents, but it was like hitting a brick block. They were unable to perceive what was going on or refused to. When I once attempted to explain, Dad remarked, "Rachel's not perfect, but neither are you." After that, I gave up, withdrawing into my own world and concentrating on my studies as a means of escaping the turmoil at home. You need to learn to get along. I felt like I was at last free when I went off to college. Determining to create a life entirely apart from the one I had been raised in, I immersed myself into my studies. I got a job at a computer business in San Francisco after graduating with honors, and I hardly ever looked back. I spent as little time as possible with Rachel and only went home for significant holidays. My parents didn't push, but they always seemed a bit offended by my isolation. Perhaps they felt that our relationship was still threatened by Rachel's shadow. Rachel, on the other hand, flourished in her position as the golden kid. She remained at home and continued to take advantage of every circumstance while enjoying my parents' attention. Every time I phoned home, the topic of Rachel's most recent accomplishments, no matter how minor, inevitably came up. Mom would exclaim, "Rachel helped organize a charity bake sale." I would roll my eyes and shift the conversation, but the animosity was still there. "She's so thoughtful." It didn't matter, I told myself. I was prosperous, self-reliant, and far away from Rachel's poisonous influence. However, I secretly still longed for the type of unwavering love and support that my parents had always saved for her. I wanted people to see me, appreciate me, and recognize all of my accomplishments without contrasting them with Rachel's. I made an effort to suppress the desire, but it persisted. In retrospect, I believe I always anticipated that things would reach a breaking point. Our family's equilibrium was too unbalanced, and the conflicts were too intense to be permanently buried. However, I had no idea how much harm Rachel's actions would do or how they would make us all face the reality we had been avoiding for so long. My relationship with Lisa only became worse as I got older. She had honed her manipulating skills by the time I was in high school. Lisa seemed to be the naive younger sister to everyone else, but I could see the cunning intellect beneath her wide-eyed exterior. My parents ignored my issues as sibling rivalry when I sought to express my complaints to them. "She's young, she'll grow out of it," was their usual answer. The spoiler alert, she didn't. I was easily irritated by Lisa, and she did it with surgical accuracy, She would, for instance, take my favorite clothing without asking and often return them ripped or discolored. She would sulk and remark, "I thought we were sisters," as if it justified the obvious disdain if I addressed her. Even worse, my parents would support her and say I should learn to share. It became evident over time that they believed Lisa could do no wrong. One instance in particular jumps out. I had put a lot of effort into earning honors for my high school graduation. I wanted the day to be unique, a time when my parents would at last recognize me as someone they could be proud of. However, Lisa was unable to grant me that. She had a tantrum about a little matter, a misplaced hair tie of all things, just before we departed for the wedding. She yelled and sobbed until my parents were completely focused on her. My parents were so overwhelmed by the time we arrived at the ceremony that they hardly recognized my accomplishment. Knowing precisely what she had done, Lisa sat there feeling proud. My getaway was college. I put a lot of effort into obtaining a scholarship that enabled me to relocate many states away. I was able to breathe for the first time in years. Even though it was little, my dorm room turned into a haven where I didn't have to worry about snooping about or protecting my possessions. I immersed myself into my studies because I found comfort in learning and making new acquaintances. It seemed like I was finally escaping Lisa's shadow for a moment, but home still hung over the horizon like a dark cloud. I would return after every holiday break, thinking that things had changed, but Lisa was Lisa. She would make fun of my accomplishments and subtly disparage them. She would roll her eyes and remark, "Oh, here we go again with your perfect little life," whenever I told her about an interesting project I was working on. In the meanwhile, my parents urged me to be the bigger person and disregard her actions. They were blind to the pain of feeling alienated inside my own family. After a while, I stopped going home at all. I would either use work as an excuse to miss Christmas or spend Thanksgiving with pals. My parents blamed it on my independence, but in reality, I was unable to cope with Lisa's destructive behavior. When I did go, it was only for brief periods of time, and I eagerly awaited my departure. But Lisa never went anywhere. She attended a nearby community college after high school, but left after only one semester. She said she wanted to discover herself, which really meant spending time at home while my parents paid for it. They seemed unconcerned. They were ecstatic to have their miracle child living with them, if nothing else. In the meanwhile, I was advancing my career by working in San Francisco for a global corporation. Although it wasn't simple, I was pleased with what I had managed to do on my own. My parents periodically phoned to give me an update on Lisa's life, even though we lived far away. She had tried a pastime here and a part-time job here, but nothing had ever stayed. However, they never presented it as an issue. Rather, they would rave about how creative and free-spirited she was, as if her lack of focus was a virtue. I bit my tongue. Even though it was annoying, it never helped me to argue with them. When my father had an almost deadly heart attack, everything changed. I'll confess that I froze when my mother phoned to inform me. Suddenly, the guy who had always looked unbeatable showed signs of weakness. I immediately made reservations for a trip home. Work could wait. I had to be with my family. My dad seemed weak and was connected to equipment that beeped menacingly when I got to the hospital. My mother clung to the chair's edges as if they were the only thing keeping her grounded, clearly shaken. Of course, there was no sign of Lisa. I didn't press her when she arrived hours later, unrepentant, and said she had been caught up with something. I was thinking about my father. My dad said he had a renewed respect for life when he was recovering. He wanted to create memories with his family and spend more time together. I grudgingly accepted his suggestion of a family vacation since I could see how much the heart attack had frightened him. Lisa was less excited, as was to be expected, but she was at a loss for options. For once, she had to comply with Dad's demands. I made an effort to have minimal expectations. I convinced myself that maybe this trip would be different. Perhaps Lisa had grown up, but I knew better in my heart. Lisa never wasted a chance to undermine me, and I had a terrible suspicion that this trip would be no different. Everything in my life came crashing to a standstill when Dad had a heart attack. Mom contacted me when I was working on a big assignment, her voice shaking with anxiety. She said, "Your dad is in the hospital. It's serious." I immediately abandoned everything and made reservations for the next trip home. It was a stomach hit to see Dad in the hospital bed, feeble and pallid. In a familial dynamic that sometimes seemed chaotic, he was the guy who always appeared bigger than life to me. I promised to support him and do all in my power to aid in his recovery. Naturally, Rachel was also there, portraying the devoted daughter. She made sure everyone saw her efforts as she darted about the hospital room getting water and fluffing pillows. "Daddy, don't worry," she crooned. "I'll handle everything." I clenched my jaw and concentrated on Dad. I remained at home for the following 2 weeks, taking care of his medication routine, cooking and cleaning, while Mom and Rachel took care of other chores. In the sake of standing by Dad, it seemed like a short-lived ceasefire, a precarious peace. However, behind the surface, the fundamental tensions were seething. Upon his recovery, Dad surprised us all by proposing a family trip. With a determined tone and a still hoarse voice, he said, "I think we need this. An opportunity to get back in touch and create some wonderful memories." I paused. Even though I didn't really want to spend a lot of time with Rachel, I couldn't bring myself to refuse her. I would fulfill Dad's request if he so desired. "All right," I said, "let's get it done." The excursion, a week-long retreat to a resort by the sea, took weeks to prepare. Rachel was exceptionally cooperative, Dad seemed joyful, and Mom was thrilled. I briefly gave in to the possibility that this vacation would mark a sea change for our family. But even before we go to the airport, the fractures start to appear. I reviewed the itinerary and verified my packing one more time the night before the trip. Since I was traveling from San Francisco, I had made my own independent travel arrangements, and everything seemed to be in order. When I went to check in at the airport the next morning, I was informed that my ticket had been canceled. Canceled? Confused, I asked, "How is that even possible? I didn't cancel it." The airline agent gave an apologetic shrug. "Yesterday, it was canceled online. I apologize, but the flight is currently completely booked. Nothing we can do will help." I felt sick to my stomach. I phoned Mom right away in the hopes of getting some clarification. I tried not to sound panicked when I said, "Mom, my ticket has been canceled. Are you familiar with this?" After a little silence, she said, "That's odd. Yesterday, Rachel was in charge of the trip plans. Perhaps that was an error." "An error?" "Yes." I could just see Rachel's self-satisfied grin. She had always been skilled at undermining me in ways that seemed harmless at first glance. This was only one more instance. Rachel pretended not to know when I called her out on the phone. She responded, "I don't know what you're talking about," in a mockingly worried tone. "Perhaps you made a mistake when you made the reservation." I felt like screaming. I chose to end the call and reserve the next flight back to San Francisco. While Rachel got to relax and have fun, I wasn't going to waste my vacation trying to find a solution. I don't mind if they want to take the family on a vacation without me. I informed Mom via SMS that I would not be attending. I wrote in short, "I hope you all have a great time." I was too exhausted to fight or explain. The next week was a mixture of relief and rage. I was thankful to be back in my own world, distant from the pandemonium, but I was also angry with Rachel for spoiling what might have been a memorable vacation for Dad. I pushed myself into my task, resolved to concentrate on something useful. Then, a few days later, Mom called me in a panic. She trembled as she said, "It's Rachel. She did a terrible thing. Your father could have—" Sobbing, she broke off. She needed a minute to gather her thoughts before continuing. "It seems that Dad's cardiac medicine vanished throughout the trip. After a thorough search, they discovered it concealed in Rachel's bag." Rachel denied everything when questioned, but the proof was obvious. She had put Dad's life in risk on purpose. When Rachel lost her temper and started hurling things and yelling at our parents, the scene became more heated. The police were summoned, and the hotel personnel had to step in. Before being placed under arrest, Rachel made a spectacle that left my parents feeling embarrassed and terrified. I had a range of emotions as I listened to Mom describe what had happened. Sadness, anger, and incredulity, but also a feeling of validation. I had been trying to show my parents Rachel's true self for years, and now they were finally seeing it. Mom sobbed as she said, "I'm so sorry. We ought to have trusted you. We ought to have seen it sooner." I was unsure of how to react. I felt compelled to reassure her that it wasn't her fault. However, a part of me was unable to overlook the years of suffering and disregard that had brought us to this point. The decisions my parents had made and the blind spots they had refused to admit were more important than Rachel alone. I understood as I hung up that this was a watershed moment for all of us. not just Rachel. It was terrible, but it also seemed like an opportunity for something new, as the familial dynamic that had shaped my whole existence was finally falling apart. A better one, something tangible. I tried to put together what had transpired in the days after my flight was canceled. Even if my parents didn't see it, Lisa was the obvious option. They were utterly unconcerned, taking pleasure in their trip without any hesitation, while I sat at home fuming with annoyance. Sometimes they sent video calls, which were like salt on the wound. As my mother extolled the virtues of the vacation, Lisa loomed smugly in the background, obviously enjoying my absence. The knowledge that my absence hardly registered with them was more painful than really missing the trip. Although I had previously experienced exclusion, this seemed like a tipping point. Although I had thought that my father's heart attack would strengthen our bond as a family, it seemed that Lisa still had a firm hold over them. I tried to ignore it, however. Perhaps it was best for me to remain absent. I didn't need to spend days dealing with Lisa's persistent hostility in a strange environment. As they say, however, karma operates in strange ways. When I woke up a few days into their vacation, I discovered that my mother had missed many calls. Fearing the worst for my father's health made my heart sink. Her voice was shaking when I eventually got to her, but it was from astonishment rather than sadness. Something had occurred, and Lisa's mask was coming off this time. It seems that my parents had become aware of the disappearance of my father's heart medicine. They first assumed it was a mistake, either a lost bottle or a packaging mistake. However, as the days passed, the pattern became evident. My dad's health could not afford such a mistake, and the pills were going missing. The tipping point was when my mom strolled into Lisa's hotel room when she was out, wanting sunscreen. All of my father's lost prescriptions were hidden away like illegal goods on Lisa's bedside table. My mother's voice trembled with shock as she revealed the terrifying revelation. Lisa had placed his life at danger by purposefully hiding his medications. My mother was at a loss for what to do. For the first time, she saw a side of Lisa that she was unable to explain or justify. Should we go up against her? My mother's voice was hardly audible above a whisper when she inquired. No, I firmly said. Await your return home. You must be ready for Lisa to turn this into a long, emotional narrative. I knew Lisa well enough to anticipate her response. She would fabricate a story, play the victim, and somehow persuade my parents that her behavior was okay. In the hopes that they would eventually defend themselves, I advised them to collect their arguments and supporting documentation before facing her. However, Lisa had her own plans as usual. My father called me in a panic later that evening. The words, "She's been arrested," came out of his trembling mouth in a blur. Uncertain whether I had heard him right, I blinked. What? Who has been taken into custody? He responded, almost incredulously. Lisa. She lost it. In spite of my warning, it seemed that my parents had approached Lisa. They were impatient. Lisa had a full-blown rage when they questioned her about the tablets. By inviting me on the trip in the first place, she accused them of betraying her and shouted obscenities. She became so enraged that she threatened to punish them if they didn't cut off contact with me. The hotel employees alerted the police because they were concerned about the worsening situation. Lisa swore at the cops when they came, refusing to comply, until they were forced to take her into jail. It seemed unreal. For years, Lisa was portrayed as the golden kid, and I as the emotional, overreactive sister. She was now languishing in a foreign prison cell, confirming all of my previous warnings about her. Instead of feeling justified, I was simply exhausted. I was fed up with the mayhem she caused and the mess my parents constantly wanted me to assist tidy up. The consequences didn't stop there. My parents found their wallets and passports were gone when Lisa was freed. They first believed it to be a straightforward error, but it didn't take long to figure out what was going on. They were left stranded after Lisa, in her vengeful rage, had hidden their possessions. They needed money sent to them for basic requirements since they were stranded in a strange nation. My parents now had to face the truth about Lisa for the first time. My mother, who used to be her strongest advocate, contacted me in tears. She wailed, "I'm so sorry. We ought to have paid attention to you." It was a time of mixed emotions. On the one hand, after years of rejection, I felt validated. However, their apologies was unable to erase the years of pain or the many instances in which I had felt alienated inside my own family. Knowing they had no other option, I nonetheless sent them the money they required. "You need to focus on getting home safely," I told them. "Once you're back, we can figure out what to do next." They agreed, their voices heavy with regret. For now, they were at Lisa's mercy, desperately trying to recover their passports so they could leave. It was a fitting irony. The daughter they had coddled for years was now the source of their greatest crisis. And for once, they couldn't ignore the truth. When Mom and Dad returned from their disastrous vacation, they looked like they had aged a decade. Their usually bright faces were shadowed with exhaustion and disbelief. I picked them up from the airport, and the weight of the silence in the car was suffocating. No one spoke much on the way back to their house, and I didn't push. It was clear they were still reeling from everything that had happened with Rachel. Once we got home and settled around the kitchen table, Mom finally broke the silence. "She could have killed him," she said, her voice trembling. Her hands clutched her coffee cup so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Hiding his medication like that, it wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. What if we hadn't caught it in time?" Dad rubbed his temples, his voice low but filled with anger. "I should have seen it sooner. I kept telling myself she'd grow out of it. But this is different. This is malicious." It was the first time I had ever heard my father admit outright that Rachel's behavior wasn't just a phase or a misunderstanding. For years, he had been her staunchest defender, always finding ways to excuse her actions. But now, even he couldn't deny the truth. Over the next few days, the tension in the house was palpable. Mom and Dad were stuck between their love for Rachel and the undeniable reality that she was hurting them. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same painful conclusion. Rachel couldn't stay. Her actions had escalated to a point where she was not just a disruptive presence, but a threat. Dad was the first to say it out loud. "She has to go," he declared one evening as we sat in the living room. His voice was steady, but his face betrayed the inner turmoil. "This isn't just about her behavior anymore. It's about safety. For all of us." Mom hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "But where will she go? What if she has nowhere to turn? We're her parents. How can we abandon her?" "We're not abandoning her," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We'll help her find somewhere to stay. But she can't keep doing this to you. It's not safe for her to be here." The decision wasn't made lightly, but it was clear there was no other option. The final straw came when Rachel, upon hearing about their plans to set boundaries, flew into a rage. She smashed a lamp, screamed obscenities, and even threatened to hurt herself if they forced her out. It wasn't the first time she had reacted this way, but this time, my parents were prepared. Dad called the authorities, something I never thought I'd see him do. When the police arrived, Rachel was still hysterical, accusing everyone of conspiring against her. It was a heartbreaking scene, but it was also necessary. The officers helped de-escalate the situation and provided resources for mental health support. Rachel was given the choice to leave voluntarily or face a more formal intervention. Reluctantly, she agreed to leave. That night, the house was eerily quiet. Mom and Dad were emotionally drained, their faces etched with guilt and sorrow. I stayed late, helping them clean up the mess Rachel had left behind, both physically and emotionally. It was hard to see them so broken, but I also felt a sliver of relief. For the first time in years, it felt like they were finally taking control of the situation. In the days that followed, my parents began to adjust to life without Rachel in the house. They reached out to a therapist to process their emotions and started making plans to ensure Rachel got the help she needed. It wasn't easy, but it was a step toward healing. Meanwhile, I found myself reflecting on how far we had all come. The fractures in our family had been deep, but this painful experience had forced us to confront truths we had avoided for too long. It wasn't the resolution any of us had hoped for, but it was a necessary step toward rebuilding our lives. Even as I helped my parents through this transition, I knew it would take time for them to truly come to terms with everything. Rachel's departure wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning of a long journey toward healing and reconciliation. For the first time, though, it felt like we were moving in the right direction. As the dust settled from Lisa's arrest and eventual eviction, my parents flew to San Francisco to spend some time with me. I could see the weariness etched into their faces as they arrived, a visible reminder of the turmoil they had endured. Despite everything, I opened my home and heart to them, knowing that this was a pivotal moment for us as a family. The first few days were awkward, but healing. My father, once stoic and reserved, began sharing his regrets. He admitted how blind they had been to Lisa's true nature and how their favoritism had fractured our family. My mother's tears were frequent, her voice trembling as she apologized for years of dismissal and invalidation. "We failed you," she said one evening over dinner, her gaze heavy with sorrow. "We failed both of you in different ways." I appreciated their honesty, but I couldn't fully let go of the hurt just yet. I told them as much, emphasizing that trust would take time to rebuild. For the first time, they listened, really listened. They didn't try to excuse their actions or defend Lisa. They simply acknowledged my pain, and that acknowledgement felt like a small, yet significant step forward. We spent the days exploring the city together, visiting parks and museums, sharing meals at local diners, and even laughing at times. It was bittersweet to see glimpses of the family dynamic I had always longed for, knowing how many years had been lost to favoritism and denial. Still, these moments were a balm, slowly patching the cracks in our relationship. One evening, after a quiet dinner at my apartment, my parents brought up Lisa. My mother admitted that while they had finally set boundaries with her, they couldn't bring themselves to abandon her completely. "She's our daughter," my father said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But we know she needs help, and we can't fix her on our own." They expressed a desire to encourage Lisa to seek mental health support. It was a sentiment I understood but couldn't fully embrace. "I can't be involved," I said firmly. "She still resents me, and anything I do will just make it worse. But I hope she gets the help she needs, for your sake and hers." My parents nodded, seeming to accept my stance. They promised to handle it themselves, starting with a carefully planned meeting in a neutral public place once they returned home. I could see the pain in their eyes as they spoke of Lisa, a mix of love, guilt, and a desperate hope for redemption. It wasn't an easy road, but it was one they were willing to walk. Before they left, my parents thanked me for my patience and support, acknowledging how much they had taken me for granted. "We want to do better," my father said, his voice resolute, "for you and for ourselves." It was a promise I hoped they would keep. As I watched them leave for the airport, I felt a cautious sense of hope. Our family wasn't healed, not completely, but we were finally facing the truth, and that was more progress than I ever thought possible. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I reconnected with friends, took on new challenges at work, and found joy in the little things. My parents kept me updated on their efforts with Lisa, who had moved in with a friend temporarily. It would be a long journey, but I knew it wasn't mine to undertake. I had my own healing to prioritize. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the weight of being overlooked, free from the shadow of Lisa's manipulations, and free to live life on my terms. My parents' newfound awareness and efforts to rebuild our relationship were a start, and for now, that was enough. The scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but as I looked toward the future, I felt a quiet strength growing within me. I had survived the storm, and now it was time to thrive.